Hello and welcome to this, the first in our series about this House has no confidence in Her Majesty's government. Today we're going to be seeking to describe what is the Liberal Democrat case for their party and their case against the government. We're very flattered to have their Chief Whip, Wendy Chamberlain, with us today, who's going to outline that for us. But first, some housekeeping. We're going to start with some introductory remarks from our academic chair, Giovanni, who's here just to make sure that everyone's allowed to say stuff that they are supposed to be able to say, and if they're saying something that's inappropriate, then he will intervene. He has some opening remarks now that he's about to give us. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Hi, everyone. My name is Giovanni Angioni. I'm a political economist and doing a PhD at the LSE. I'm very glad to share this debate. We are going through a very special moment, especially in the UK. Brexit is finally fast approaching. The COVID-19 emergency has disrupted even more a social system that was already precarious. So there's a lot to discuss. I'm sure it's going to be very interesting, and we will get many insights about the UK, but also about all this situation everywhere else. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Now we'll head over to Ms. Chamberlain, who's going to provide us some opening remarks on how she sees the state of play in government at the moment.
That's great. Thank you very much, Joseph, and thank you very much to the LSE for having me here today. My name's Wendy Chamberlain. I'm the Member of Parliament for North East Fife in Scotland, and as Joseph said, I am the Chief Whip for the Liberal Democrats appointed earlier this year, and I'm also spokesperson on Scotland, Wales and Department of Work and Pensions. So I'm quite a busy person. I think the first thing just to say in terms of myself is I don't, and I suppose every politician says this, portray myself as a sort of real politician, whatever that is. I'm still kind of pinching myself in some regards, having elected in 2019. But I joined the Liberal Democrats in 2015, having previously had a background as a police officer for 12 years, working in military resettlement, supporting service leavers into employment, and latterly working for a global drinks manufacturer, both in Fife, the Central Belt and the north of Scotland. So I do believe that I've got some real life experience that helps me to support my constituents at what has been a very difficult time. And I suppose that's the challenge. We don't know what normal is. But actually, I was not a debater at university. And the last time I did a debate was back in 2019, face-to-face for St Andrews Aberdeen University, where it was exactly the same topic as we're debating today, which was we have no faith in His Majesty's government. Now, at that time, obviously, Theresa May was Prime Minister, and I actually started by saying that this government has no faith in itself. And that was definitely replicated in relation to the 2017 general election and the direction of travel that the government were going in relation to Brexit. And in some ways where we are now seems absolutely even worse. Without COVID, we are at a breaking point physically, breaking point mentally. This is clearly having a huge impact, the COVID pandemic, on people's mental health and well-being. But we're also at a breaking point as a country. We're in the middle of a global pandemic, but we're caught in a constitutional crisis. And you would absolutely expect me to refer to that as a Scottish MP. We're 6 weeks away from Brexit, teetering on the edge of a no deal, which we know would be a disaster for the economy, whichever way the government spins it. And the government indeed is a government that has in decades past prided itself on its being the party of business and delivering for the economy. On Monday in Parliament, we will be debating a motion in relation to lorry parks in Kent. I don't believe that that is what people believed that they were going to get when we talked about taking back control. And we do see a huge rise in a form of separatism which threatens the very existence of the UK. And actually, I would argue that we're seeing nationalism that has delivered Brexit in some respects, but also seen an increase in support for independence in Scotland. But I would also say, and I'll go on to say from a Liberal Democrat perspective, that there are opportunities that presents, though I'm always very conscious of using the term opportunity when talking about the pandemic and how devastating that's been. But I do think the government, and I think this is very telling when you compare the Scottish government and people in Scotland's response to the Scottish Government and the UK Government. One of the key things in terms of how the Government has failed us and delivered no faith is the fact that it's failed on basic communications. Arguably, you could say that the Scottish Government has delivered many of the same outcomes or issues that we've seen in relation to the rest of the UK in the pandemic, in terms of issues in care homes, with testing, with schools, with exams, but actually has had a much better response from the public. And I do think that that is a credit to Nicola Sturgeon as First Minister in terms of the clarity of our communications. We've arguably economically, in terms of lockdown, went harder and for longer in Scotland with the same outcomes, and dare I say it, with a misguided idea that we could manage to eliminate COVID. But what we're seeing is a rise in support for the SNP as the party of government and for independence. And I think that is fundamentally laid at the door of the UK government. Boris Johnson arguably is single-handedly responsible for the rise in support for independence in Scotland. And we just have to look at his comments earlier this week in terms of devolution. And I'll come on to explain some of those. In terms of the Labour Party, it does appear that they would, since Keir Starmer has become a leader of the Labour Party, look that they would be better set up to deal with the pandemic. Starmer is clearly a very competent individual. He has a track record of success at managing large public body when he was Director of Public Prosecutions. But there's no doubt that Labour itself is still dealing and working through some of the issues, I'll be kind, that were experienced under the Corbyn leadership, and as a result is not necessarily a party that has its house in order to be able to be looking externally and responding as it should be. But I am passionate about working with Labour where we can in order to remove this Conservative government. I've engaged with them on electoral reform because I believe that that really is the way forward to deal with a number of things. But I'm not convinced that they have the answers to many of the other problems facing us. And actually our two-party system is at the root of some of those challenges. In terms of Brexit, the Labour Party don't want to say anything because they're caught in a bind between the pro-Brexit supporters in Red Wall seats and elsewhere who moved away from them and others. And there's even talk of them voting for a Brexit deal if it is presented before Parliament, no matter how thin that might be. And I do find Labour's silence frustrating in terms of keeping the UK together, speaking as a Scot. If Labour want a path to any majority, it runs through Scotland. They have never been the ruling party of government in this country without winning a majority of seats in Scotland. But arguably, I don't think Starmer has anything to say in relation to independence or offering a compelling vision for the future of our country. And indeed, it's over back to Gordon Brown this week with his article in the New Statesman talking about what a future for the UK might look like that would combat that rise in support for independence. So therefore, let me talk about the Liberal Democrats. I do think that what we talk about, what we have, are best suited to grapple with the existential crises that we're facing. So one of the things that we see in terms of Build Back Better, to borrow the Prime Minister's phrase, is the implementation of a universal basic income. One of the things I've learned in my first year as an MP is the fact that there are the safety net that we think our welfare system has big holes in it. And I think one of the key challenges of this year is that we have seen a number of people, the excluded, the 3 million who've been unable to access any support from the government, are a good example of people who have ended up having to access the welfare system in a way that they never expected to. And I think really this year has shattered some assumptions about whether what we have in place is sufficient. So I would admit that at the start of this crisis, I had some sympathy with what all the governments were trying to do, and it made sense in some regards, the Chancellor's approach of using the existing infrastructures to deliver support and deliver it quickly, as they did through the furlough scheme and the self-employment support scheme. But actually, over time, it's clear that we need to do more than that, and a universal basic income approach would have been best able to deliver that. And I think what I would say is we're not just talking about it as Liberal Democrats, we are looking at the economic case for that and how we would deliver it, because I absolutely understand that that is a key challenge when we're talking about universal basic income. What do we mean by that? And more importantly, how do we pay for it? We remain pro-European. We want to maintain our close economic ties with Europe. It's really about geography, which again is one of my arguments in relation to Scottish independence. We will continue to need to have a relationship with the rest of the UK and indeed the rest of Europe. And you know, we have definitely, there's no doubt that our fortunes have been tied to that as a party, but we saw a huge increase in support and membership over last year. And in fact, what we are seeing now is not quite regret, but a suggestion that if that question had been asked again, that the response would have been different. And that brings me back on, I suppose, to binary politics. The key tenet of liberal politics is reform. It's about looking at our institutions and seeing where change needs to be made. It's about, and this goes right back to the very start of our constitution, ensuring that no individual is trapped by conformity or lack of ability or lack of opportunity. And I do think that that's something neither the Labour or the Conservatives or indeed the SNP do when the very first line of the SNP's constitution is to achieve independence. What would they fail to do is to talk about for what end and how does that make lives better. So as I said, I became a member of the Lib Dems after watching Nick Clegg's resignation speech on the television. But one of the key things he said was that the politics of fear and division potentially were winning. And it was a prescient speech when you think about it 5 years ago, talking about the role of the UK in the wider world, the rise of nationalism and the UK's place in Europe being under threat. And I do believe as a party we have the answers to some of those huge challenges. He also said it would be liberal politics which would be needed to fight out against the politics of nationalism, grievance and fear. I think one of the key things for me is that we have become very binary in terms of our political discourse. And Liberal Democrats actually really recognise that life is really not grey, but it's just everything is much more complex than that. And I do think that we have failed as a body politic to properly engage and have those nuanced and potentially areas of compromise politics that will help deliver solutions. Again, another reason why I believe passionate in electoral reform, because it is less likely to drive that division. But we've definitely seen moments of hope in the last wee while. We've obviously seen the victory of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris in the US, not on a platform of populist politics, but with liberal ideas and liberal plans to deliver. And I do believe that that is what we need more of in the UK and around the world. And that is what the Liberal Democrats stand for. What does that mean in terms of having no faith in Her Majesty's government? It is people put faith in the government last year to deliver on Brexit, to deliver, get Brexit done. But what did getting Brexit done really need? Of course, the government didn't foresee what was going to come in relation to COVID, but it also shows how that binary nature of politics is just completely unable to deal with those complex challenges we're facing in the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to continue on this topic of Brexit. What is the Lib Dems' current strategy in trying to mitigate what they see as the real economic harms that are going to come in the new year?
So I think it's interesting because in some ways, what was the Liberal Democrats' position on Brexit? I think for a smaller third party in politics, sometimes getting one of your policy messages over can be quite difficult. But nobody was in any doubt about what our position in relation to Brexit was. Obviously, we're in that post-Brexit landscape where we have left almost, we're halfway out the door. So is it right and proper that as Liberal Democrats that we just simply say that it should be reversed? I don't think that's the right approach. I think we do have to engage with the debate and ensure that as far as possible those close economic ties and close ties that we feel as Europeans are maintained. And I think that's one of the key challenges in terms of the difference, the distance travelled between 2016 and 2020 in terms of what was promised in relation to Brexit and what we are now looking at. So I think it's we have to be realistic that we have left, we are leaving, and it's about ensuring that as far as possible we keep we deliver as much as we possibly can through a trade deal, and the maintenance of things that, dare I say it, Brexiteers said were never going to be touched in the first place.
So, as you say, in the election of last year, there was no doubt that the Lib Dems were an unashamedly pro-EU party, in your words. You maintained this position post-election when it was clear the Conservatives would win a major majority in the House. But since then, your party has dropped its commitment to European membership. And there's almost been a quietness, certainly in comparison to last year, on the issue. So my question is, what is more important to you, the principle of the economic good of staying in the European Union, or the political expedience of moving on from this debate, which you lost?
Yeah. So, yeah. So the first thing I would say is we have not given up on our commitment, and I'll absolutely accept that this could be sort of arguments on the head of a pin here. I suppose it's about how do you accept the reality of a decision being taken and happening, and when is it right to? Is it appropriate in the midst of a global pandemic for us to have front and centre our campaigning approach to say that we need to campaign to return to the EU at the earliest opportunity? I don't think that is meeting people where they are and the real life challenges that they're dealing with. But are we pro-European, and do we want to return to the EU at some point in the future? Absolutely. But I think politics in some respects is about popularity. So it's about continuing to hold on to those principles, but actually talking about the things that people are interested in. And I think that's one of the things that Liberal Democrats have been very good at, in terms of having that reputation as local campaigners who deliver on a local level. I would say that some of our voting systems, etc., are some of the things that potentially maybe prevent us from making a breakthrough elsewhere. I mean, the revoke stance is really interesting, and the challenge around that. John Curtis, the pollster, he actually has said in a piece that he wrote for the Liberal Democrat History Group that he did not believe that revoke had really damaged the Liberal Democrats within the election. What we failed to do was to really, at the end of the day, attract sufficient Labour Remainers in order to get us over the line in a number of key seats. So, my position around revoke was, if the Conservatives' position is elect us with a majority, we will get Brexit done. Well, elect the Liberal Democrats with a majority and we'll stop Brexit from happening, because that's what we wanted to happen.
One issue that you already raised that came from the divisive campaign is that different areas of our country have come to very different conclusions on the good or harm of the European Union. You've described maintaining the Union, the United Kingdom Union that is, as one of the most important issues that the country faces, and one of the most important issues to you as a Scottish MP. So what do you see as the tangible strategy now for maintaining this union? Do you support, for example, a second referendum in the short term?
A second referendum in relation to Scottish independence, do you mean?
Yes,
yeah.
That's right.
And I did warn before we went live, Joseph, that I may have either of my children appear. I hadn't anticipated my husband, so apologies for that. So our position is, and I was elected on, when I won last year, my seat was the most marginal seat in the UK. There was only 2 votes between the Liberal Democrats and the SNP in 2017. And when you look at the result last year, my seat had the smallest Labour percentage in Scotland, and also the largest fall in votes for the Conservatives elsewhere other than in the Speaker's seat. And obviously in the Speaker's seat, that's because nobody stands against them. So, soft Conservatives either lent me their vote, or dare I say it, were previously Liberal Democrat, given that we'd held the seat until 2015 and came back to us. And part of that was because we stood on a pro-EU, pro-UK position. And I would dare I say, a lot of those voters probably voted for me for the latter, if not for the former. And so part of that was that we believed that now was not the time in relation to an independence referendum, and Brexit needed to be dealt with, and we needed to establish what that future relationship was with the EU. And I suppose we're in exactly the same set of circumstances with a turbo add of COVID into the mix. Is it right for politicians to be spending their time talking about constitutional issues when when I read today that it's estimated that 71% of hospitality businesses are saying that they may close next year. So I'm not sure that that's right. Where I think things are changing is in relation to England and the realisation that in England we are governed pretty centrally. I remember looking at the business in Parliament one week and seeing that there was a debate in Parliament on toilets, local amenities, toilets. Now, I remember thinking, why is that being debated in Westminster? Surely that is something that should be devolved at a local authority or mayoral level. And so I think there is a recognition increasingly, and we saw that with the sort of revolt of the North, as it were, through Andy Burnham and others in relation to lockdown and response to COVID. And so I think that is the possibility of taking forward something that Liberal Democrats have believed in for a long time, which is a federal approach to how the UK works. And so I think there is potentially some movement there. You see it as well in Wales. Wales have just voted this week to give local authorities the option to elect councillors on a single transferable vote basis. So there's real changes emerging. And indeed in England will be the only part of the UK where 16 and 17-year-olds don't have a vote. Obviously, in both the Senedd and the Holyrood elections, 16-year-olds can vote, and obviously 16-year-olds did vote in the Scottish referendum in 2014 as well. So I think there is a lot of potential for change, and actually, that is my argument from an independence or Scottish independence perspective. Is Westminster broken? Yes, we'll agree on that diagnosis. But it's not about failing Scotland in particular. It's about the fact that it is not fit for 21st century UK either.
So further on this Scottish independence is that you've just blamed Boris Johnson single-handedly to some extent for the recent rise in support for independence. But if you actually look at the various parties' varying levels of political support within Scotland, you see that the Conservatives are actually by far the most popular. This is partly because the SNP overwhelmingly win progressive support in Scotland. They are the main challenger to the Conservatives in Scotland. So in the recent election, we saw that the Labour swing, the decrease in Labour vote, it was down 8% for Labour, up 8% for SNP. So we see that they are winning progressives. So, as a progressive party, how do you make sure that the unionist parties are the main progressive force in Scotland?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and I think that has been, up until the independence referendum, the Tories were probably in not quite a free fall, but had definitely declined significantly in Scotland. And I think what that did was it did sort of crystallise the sort of unionist and independence side of things. So, I always say we're dealing with a binary constitutional question in Scotland. The rest of the UK is just a couple of years behind us in relation to Brexit. And I think this comes back to, where Labour are failing, because there is no doubt that there has been a large move of Labour, what was traditionally Labour areas, into support for the SNP. And I think that's a real challenge. I think in terms of the Conservatives, I think they are falling away now. And the latest polling in relation to the Scottish Parliament elections had Labour leapfrogging the Conservatives into second place in that respect. But the reality is that increased rise in support for the SNP. And I've mentioned John Curtis already, but I'll mention him again in that he did a piece of work. I was at an event called These Islands back in February, which is a pro-UK think tank, arguably with a Scottish focus, because obviously that's the sort of most critical area just now. But he spoke about the fact that in 2014 in the independence referendum, people did not take into account how they felt about the EU in relation to how they thought about independence. And so in 2015, the 45% voted for the SNP, and that's where you saw the 56 seats out of the 59 in Scotland. By 2017, you see the SNP fall back, and he argues that that is because people who'd voted Leave in 2016 and previously supported the SNP, you know, I admire them. They don't want to work with anybody. They drifted away, and then in 2019 that increase in support for the SNP is driven by people thinking about how they feel about the EU in relation to how they might feel about independence. The challenge for me as a Scottish Liberal Democrat in that regard is that's my voters, isn't it? Those people who voted no in 2014 and yes to remain in the EU in 2016, they're Liberal Democrats in terms of where they stand on those two constitutional questions. And I think it's very interesting that Douglas Ross, if you haven't looked at him before, you know, he's certainly been not afraid within the Conservatives to point out where he thinks that the UK party is going wrong in relation to Scotland. But he doesn't necessarily seem to be on very much success in changing that narrative, hence the Prime Minister's observation this week. And I can see how Johnson said that this week. I can imagine in terms of speaking to this northern research group of Tory MPs, some of whom are on wafer thin majorities in those red wall seats, who are probably concerned about, you know, the public resonance with Andy Burnham's comments and others, and saying to them, no, you don't want to be having that kind of engagement. Devolution's been a disaster. And yeah, it's very obvious that he you know, probably did that in a very unthinking way.
So I suppose my final question on then the union is, how do you justify as a party, from a purely pragmatic point of view, how do you justify the further division of the progressive cause of the unionist Scottish voice? I'm talking particularly the division between the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats. Surely you would be better served working together in the current electoral system.
Yeah, and I think we do. I think if you actually looked at the electoral map, the areas of Scotland where the Liberal Democrats previously did well, you know, we obviously had 12 seats prior to 15, and where Labour did well are quite different. I think the concern is whether to be a second independence referendum is that it will be more difficult to bring the pro-UK side together. I mean, to be honest, have a real difficulty with the term unionist. It's not one that sits comfortably with me. It's not something that I think reflects who, you know, my politics and what I believe in. I would describe myself as a federalist first and foremost. And I have to say, in terms of the narrative over, well, even before I became involved in politics, have kind of put me off flags a bit. You know, even from a very pro-EU perspective, it's not something that, you know, I feel necessarily fits overall with my identity. And I think that's one of the saddest things around where we are. And I think the progressive side of politics is as guilty as this is otherwise, that everything has become quite binary, that you can be one thing but not the other. Whereas actually I argue that you can be a number of things.
Okay, so I'll move now inevitably to COVID-19, which has been a major area of criticism for the government. I want to start off by saying that you mentioned that the Scottish government made many of the same mistakes, despite having a different party completely in power. So to some extent, aren't a lot of these mistakes inevitable ones?
I think there's an argument to be made for that, absolutely. And I think you have to, you know, only have to look globally just now to see that we are not the only country that is dealing with a second wave of infections. As you can imagine, in terms of my casework, I get a bit of everything, and I definitely have noticed a degree of fracturing in public consensus around restrictions, adherence to those restrictions, and the cases for masks, social distancing, 10 o'clock curfews, etc. But then you look at Sweden this week, and Sweden, which took a very different approach, arguably to other Western European countries, is now itself starting to put in restrictions and dealing with it. So I think absolutely there is an argument to be made for that. But I would also say that any business and any government would have, so maybe this is the police officer in me speaking, would have on a risk register a pandemic and plans to deal with a pandemic. And I think, we have arguably been complacent or known that it's there to deal with, but there are more pressing concerns, for example Brexit, concerns arguably that we've brought upon ourselves that meant that we failed to be prepared for that. Both the UK government and the Scottish government carried out exercises in preparedness for pandemics in the last 5 years. And in both of those sets of circumstances, I think there were two key failings. One was an assumption that any future pandemic would be flu-based, and that we would have the medicines to treat it, and that second of all, that we would have the opportunity, we would actually do and learn the lessons and deliver. So, for example, the UK government pandemic response talked about working more closely with the devolved nations, and for the Scottish one, it was about lessons identified, who's delivering it, and those in the NHS, etc., said we do not have the capacity to deal with this and to do the necessary planning. So unsurprisingly, it didn't happen. So I think, yes, you can have some sympathy for where we've got to and the speed of some of the measures that had to be put in place, but I think we also had the opportunity to deal with it. And in terms of what's happened since then, I think one of the key failings, if you look at it globally, what countries are managing this well, and they tend to be countries in Southeast Asia, where they have their test, trace and isolate is just, they're absolutely jumping on things, or indeed if New Zealand, you're largely shutting yourself down. And I think I think both governments and arguably Welsh Government as well failed to properly deliver a test, trace and isolate system that allowed us to work better, or at least minimise a second wave, because if you've not got the testing capacity, we've had lots of testing capacity, but not necessarily people getting tested. Then you've got your tracing element, and we know the huge issues with the app and other things. And indeed, I've ended up with 2 apps on my phone, because when I'm in Scotland, I need the Scottish app, and when I'm in London, I need the English one. But then in terms of isolation, I think this is the key thing the UK government has got wrong, is it's turned into an argument between saving the economy and saving public health. Whereas actually, if you get the public health things right, you will have a longer term positive impact on the economy. The reality is people won't isolate if they can't afford to do so, if they can't put food on the table. So I think that is one of the key things that everybody has potentially got wrong. And I will acknowledge that there's challenges elsewhere in the world as well. But I'll go back to what I said in my opening remarks, that the comms, particularly from the UK government, have never really given people confidence that they're in control.
As we discuss this, the theme for the event is not just anti-government, it's also what is the case for the Lib Dems. That's one of the things we're trying to ascertain. So as we look at what the Lib Dems had called for ahead of time, rather than hindsight criticisms, which are legitimate, we can actually see quite a strong alignment with Labour. You both called for the circuit breaker, you both called for extending the furlough, you both were highly critical of test and trace throughout the summer, and you both called for free school meals. So where do the Lib Dems actually differ from Labour in this case?
Well, I think you're right. You're right on all those things, and I suppose this goes back to my comments and my remarks that it does appear that Labour would have dealt with this situation more competently. I think one of the differences I've already touched on from an economy perspective has certainly been our approach or support for UBI. I think the other bit has been that we have potentially been more. I do feel that the phrase "follow the science" is potentially is redundant now, because the science is going in some different directions. And indeed, I sit on the coronavirus APPG, where we've had a variety of opinions and feedback. But I do think that we look at where we were different. So we did vote against the Coronavirus Act. And the main reason that we did that was our real concern around the care easements that were in place in relation to local authorities, and the real suffering that people with disabilities and vulnerable groups were experiencing as a result of that. We also voted against the 10 o'clock curfew, because we believed that the case had not been made from a scientific perspective to for that to be the case. You know, it's very obvious when you think about it. Everybody coming out at the same time from the same from a number of premises in a small local area means that you're much more likely to see mixing out with. Again, this is the police officer part in me, I suppose, coming out and thinking that that crowd management is always more difficult at a certain time when people have been consuming alcohol as well. So I think those would be the sort of two key things that I would point out, that I think we have been more radical in terms of potentially how we support the most vulnerable financially in society. Plus, we have not been scared to, if we do not feel that the case has been made for public health restrictions, we've been up for saying it and voting accordingly.
I want to continue on this theme in not just establishing your case against the government, but also your case for the Lib Dems. In the 2019 election, the case was pretty clear-cut. You were the party more moderate than how Corbyn was perceived and how Johnson was perceived, and you were the only unashamedly pro-EU party. But now you say that it's time to be realistic about the European Union. It's time to move on. And you also say that Starmer's leadership puts the Labour Party in a good position for government, for dealing with the coronavirus. So I just want to lay the groundwork here of what the case broadly is for the Liberal Democrats in a post-pandemic Britain.
Okay, so I think we are hamstrung by the electoral system on which we operate. And I suppose arguably that can be one of the factors that played a part in our disappointing result last year. There's no doubt that the narrative around Jo Swinson as Prime Minister was something that did not go down well, and it probably did not go down well because it did not appear credible that a party could go from, at that time, 20 MPs to winning a parliamentary majority under a first-past-the-post system. So I think it's about the case for the Liberal Democrats in a post-pandemic world is kind of driven by some of that narrative. So if we have no faith in this government, in Her Majesty's government, and we've talked here about Brexit, and we've talked here so far about COVID, but if we look at the other things that are happening in relation to this government, if we look at concerns we have around, we had PPE corruption accusations this week. We've previously talked about that in relation to the liaison committee and information around foreign states interfering in our processes. We've looked at failings in relation to housing. And a lot, it does feel a bit kind of, and obviously I'm saying this as somebody who was at university in the 90s, but it does feel a bit like that sort of major government when it just seems to be sort of corruption or poor behaviour from the Conservatives on an ongoing basis that kind of really chipped away at that credibility. And so my argument from the Lib Dems perspective is we can reach the places electorally that Labour cannot. So one of the positive things about our result in 2019 is we are now in second place in 90 seats across the UK, usually in places where Labour is a very distant third. Now, do I think Unite to Remain was the right approach? Well, the results speak for themselves. So Unite to Remain did absolutely nothing for the Liberal Democrats, or indeed the Greens or Plaid Cymru either. But what that suggests to me is that there should be more opportunities to work more collaboratively with Labour in order to deliver Liberal Democrat MPs as opposed to Tory ones that then chip away at the Conservatives' overall majority. So I think that is the argument, and I suppose, and maybe I'm a clean skin in relation to coalition, obviously, in terms of our coalition with the Conservatives, but I do believe those involved with the coalition went into that coalition with the best of intentions. And when you look at what came about post 2015, you can potentially see the things that Liberal Democrats had put the brakes on or the buffers on with the Conservatives. So my argument there would be, for those who are concerned about overly left-wing, more socialist, Liberal Democrats again can be exactly that kind of more moderate, tempering approach. I also think, dare I say it, that liberalism in itself is a very good thing. And actually, I think one of the challenges for Liberal Democrats is the fact that many of the key fundamentals that we believe in have, dare I say it, from a societal perspective, been delivered.
So I want to continue on electoral reform because to some extent it seems to me that your own argument works against you. You say that the electoral system we have forces binary choices. Now, doesn't that force most voters in other than these 90 seats in the rest of the seats basically to ignore the Lib Dems? And so therefore, what is the case for Lib Dems continuing to stand candidates where all they're likely to do is detract from other progressive parties rather than detract from the Conservatives?
I think it's a really good point, Joseph, and I think there's no doubt that our tactics, our campaign tactics, are driven by the electoral reality that we face. Now, it's interesting, in Scotland, obviously we have coming up in May the Holyrood elections, and the same as the Senedd in Wales, they are voted on an AMS system. So we have a number of constituency seats which are won in first past the post, and then we have the top-up regional lists. And interestingly, in 2016, the last Scottish Parliament elections, we were successful in 4 constituency seats and only 1 list seat. So arguably, the very system of PR that we argue and stand for is one that we don't seem to do very, very well at. But I think that is potentially driven by the fact that we, as a result of first past the post in Westminster, end up with areas of success and also with complete sinkholes of no-hoper seats. Indeed, my first sort of experience in parliamentary elections was in 2017. I stood in Stirling for the Liberal Democrats. And, it was what was called a paper candidate. So we had no chance of winning. We did no real active campaigning other than a leaflet across the constituency ensuring that I was there to participate in any debates or, newspaper requirements, etc. So I think, there is potentially a good argument, that's an argument that why do we stand when we're in a first past the post position? I think one is because regardless of electoral pacts, which we clearly saw in Unite to Remain, people will still vote for, some people will still vote for the party they want to vote for, regardless of the chances of that party being elected. And I think it's important for a party that is UK-wide to give people the opportunity to do that. I think that is very important. And I suppose it is about how you potentially build a target seat for the future. So if you think about it from a pyramid approach, how do you identify what's a likely target seat in the future? It's not just about where it came in terms of the last election. It's about the party infrastructure that it has. It's about the council seats that it holds in England and in Scotland and Wales. It's about potentially the Holyrood or Senedd seats that it has as well. So you have to be able to build that kind of capacity. But there's no doubt that at the moment, our campaigning infrastructure is definitely skewed and impacted by first past the post. The reality is, for me, is more people didn't vote for me in December as voted for me, and I am their representative. And I'd much rather that people had voted for me because they wanted to vote for me, as opposed to being the person that they like the least. But surely a more representative voting system, PR, single transferable votes, the Liberal Democrats' preference, means that more people will at least feel that they input in some respect, even if it wasn't as their first preference, to the person that ends up representing them. And indeed, I had a debate on electoral reform as an adjournment debate earlier on in the year, and Chloe Smith, the Minister for the Constitution, her argument for first past the post was around that politics of place. I think the phrase that she used was, when an MP walks down the high street, you should be able to look them in the eye and know that they're your MP. And I just think that that's just a false argument. Just because somebody is elected through a more proportional form of representation doesn't mean that they don't represent a place. And actually, better that you give people potentially, you're looking at constituencies with 3 or 4 members is one of the ways to deliver that. I do think the recent constituencies bill, which has just come back, just left the Commons again after Lord's amendments, where the 650 seats, but a much smaller tolerance level, potentially is going to make some of the boundary changes all over the UK very, very challenging and very difficult, and I think are going to throw up some boundaries that, for me, will not deliver constituencies that feel very community or area based or recognised.
One argument that often comes up against electoral reform is the sort of instability that it entails. If you look at the Parliament from 2017 to 19, it was chaos. If you look at the most recent coalition, it felt like to many that one party, the junior party, your party, had to walk back on a great number of their pledges in order to make the government work. So how can we have a proportional representation voting system, which was rejected 32% to 68% in 2011, this is a major ground for that? How can we have that and still have stable government?
Yeah. So first thing I would say is that I don't believe alternative vote is actually a form of proportional representation. But I would agree, obviously, that the referendum happened in 2011 because that was what the Liberal Democrats managed to get out of the coalition, as opposed to a vote in a more proportional system. I think it is that there's a cultural shift required in relation to electoral reform as well. Even just the way that the House of Commons is set up, with each side of the chamber, as opposed to other parliaments which have a horseshoe chamber. That in itself just suggests a more adversarial. The official opposition, it's their job to oppose, but the government in power at the time always seem very surprised when the opposition disagree with them. The fact that the Prime Minister and Leader of the Opposition, or indeed anybody at the dispatch box, is two sword lengths separated from one another. I think our system is set up to be adversarial, and culturally, I think, the population of voters is used to it being like that as well. I think history will be kinder to the coalition potentially than it was at the time. And I think you just need to look at potentially those countries that are maybe managing better during COVID just now, or just seen as more consensual form of politics. When you look at, when you look at social media, when you look at those kind of aspects, actually maybe wouldn't we be more able to attract different kinds of people into standing for Parliament if it was less adversarial? I think it's really interesting when you look at New Zealand. So New Zealand had exactly the same system as us, moved to proportional representation in 1996, and now we actually have Labour, Jacinta Ardern, winning a majority for the first time since that system came into play, but has actually still produced or still worked to deliver a coalition government, because culturally New Zealand is in a position where that is the expectation. And I think we get to a place sometimes where actually how do we work in business? How do we work in organisations? We don't work in a way that one side has the ball and that's what happens. We work in much more collaborative ways. And I just firmly believe our politics should kind of represent that. I'm not saying any of that is easy, but I think I think we are seeing some of the divisions or binary divisions we've seen in society because that's culturally the way our politics works.
So you admitted that you said that it's difficult to justify from a purely pragmatic perspective splitting up the progressive vote, and also that you say that there are artificial divisions on party lines. So I want to have a look at how you and Labour are quite similar in many ways. The two flagship policies that came out of your conference were the green reforms and the universal basic income. Universal basic income, you seem to go further than Labour went in its 2017 manifesto and 2019 manifesto. You said it would be a phased introduction. Labour says a trial. So it seems pretty similar. Then we look at your green policy. You want to insulate all low-income homes. That's Labour policy. You want to invest in renewables. That's Labour's green industrial revolution, but on a smaller scale. So what is the tangible difference from a policy platform between the Lib Dems and Labour, and therefore how can you justify splitting up the vote in this way?
Well, I think it's fair to have policy areas where we are quite well aligned with other parties, and I think there will always be, when you're developing a manifesto or you're developing policy, you will always be looking for those top headlines of what you sell to voters through your manifesto and through your communications, and that doesn't necessarily mean that the overall piece is the same, and they're same, and as a result, you shouldn't have the opportunity for separate parties. I think on the green stuff, I think yes, Labour and the Liberal Democrats are largely in the same place, and we're certainly being much more progressive than the Conservatives. And in terms of our manifestos in 2019, both Labour and the Liberal Democrats, well outscored the government. But I think there are other places where we are different. And as I am not a centrist, I'm a liberal, but there is that bit where I think the Liberal Democrats provide some degree of balance, because one of the key issues in 2019 in terms of Labour was, I think along with all the other issues that potentially Labour were experiencing last year, was that their spending plans were not seen as credible. How was that going to be delivered from a financial perspective? I mean, ironically, I think there is that bit around, last year, universal Wi-Fi for everybody. It was scoffed at, but it doesn't seem so daft now as we're dealing with the pandemic. But I think a fiscal credibility is something that Labour have always struggled with, and I think our manifestos have always been well costed and externally been seen to be well costed as well.
Another reason I bring up this splitting of the sort of progressive side of the vote in UK politics is if we look at the Lib Dems record, which I admit you weren't a member at the time, but you did soon after join. So there is answerability to some extent. Their record in government saw the tuition fees triple, famously, that you had promised to revoke. In your 2019 manifesto that you stood on, proposed to repeal the bedroom tax, which Lib Dems had voted for, the benefits cap, which Lib Dems had voted for, the elements of privatisation we now see in the NHS, which Lib Dems had voted for. Isn't it again a case of the Lib Dems standing on a progressive platform, but then when it comes to political expedience, surrendering some of those principles that put them into government in the first place?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I think one of the challenges there, and I'm not going to shy away from those decisions, and dare I say it, neither would Ed Davey as leader, and he would certainly talk about the things that we were proud of that were delivered in the coalition. But I think there is an element of holding us, and I'm saying this cautiously, holding us potentially to a higher standard potentially than other parties, that we are seen, and I suppose that's to our credit, that we are seen largely as, or were up until a coalition, seen as a party that you can trust and that you can look at values. And I think for a smaller party, when you start to lose the argument in relation to values, and you've described some of the ways that that happened for us, that you see a major electoral regression, and that's clearly what you saw in the election in 2015. And I suppose this comes back to your question about splitting the progressives. Would we have seen the same regression if we had been in a coalition with Labour? I don't think you would have, because the expectation would have been, given that the party came about through the merger of the Liberals and the Social Democrats, and actually I'm involved with a book that's going to be recognised in the Limehouse Declaration in the new year, that we were always seen to be left of centre, but the reality is, in terms of our leadership as we went into coalition, it was probably more right of centre, and that's then where you saw. So I suppose what potentially happened in the coalition was voters thought we were here, and actually we were there, and so it felt like an even bigger betrayal.
Finally, before we move on to our audience Q&A, what I find fascinating is at this time, when the Lib Dems were facing electoral oblivion and they were facing accusation that they had betrayed what they stood for, you decided to join the party. Why is it that you personally decided that, as a progressive, you would join the Lib Dems and not the Labour Party in a time when they had failed so dramatically in the coalition?
Yeah, so that is a really interesting question, and I would say that if you actually look at the Liberal Democrat membership over the last decade, 2015 was one of the first spikes in membership, people joining. So I certainly wasn't alone in that regard, though obviously post the Brexit referendum and post the general election 2017, we saw further spikes, and last year as well. I suppose it's a wee bit of, you know, where you come from, what you're made of. So, you know, I don't come from a Liberal Democrat family. I come from the west coast of Scotland, where growing up Labour vote was weighed. My father was a police officer. My parents are, I would say, small c Conservatives. So I did not grow up in you know, thinking that Labour were necessarily a good thing. So I have to be quite honest that Labour were never a party that I considered voting for. When I came of voting age, by that time I was at university in Edinburgh, and you know, I had studied modern studies at high school, and Liberal Democrat policy, what they believed in, was something that really resonated with me. So I had kind of always been a voter. I probably would say, as a police officer, couldn't get involved politically anyway, but during the coalition years I was probably quite disengaged, though at a local election level I would continue to vote for Lib Dems. And interestingly, my husband is a member of the SNP. He was very active in the 2014 referendum. I was a very typical, I would argue, no thanks voter, that kind of, you know, shy voter, the shy no thanks voter, as it were. And I do remember the result in 2015, and just feeling that, okay, you've kind of hidden for too long. If this is actually the values that you believe in and that you think are important to be maintained, you need to do something about it. And that's really what drove me to vote, to join. And I suppose the reality is as a Liberal Democrat, I suppose I'm realistic about what our likely outcomes are from an electoral perspective. So just being involved and feeling that I was adding my voice was what was important at that stage. I certainly no way saw myself as being a candidate. In fact, quite the reverse, not something I ever saw myself doing. So one of the reasons why I'm really pleased to be here today.
Thank you. So I'll now move on to the our audience questions, which have either been pre-submitted or in our live chat function now.
Yeah.
So Sammy Peterson from LSE, he asks, to what extent do you blame the UK's majoritarian electoral system rather than the proportional representation system on the breakdown of trust we've recently seen in the UK government?
Yeah, I think both are interlinked. I think one of the key things for me is that that our parliamentary system and referendums don't go together. So I think that's been one of the key things, that it's been seen that our voting system and our parliamentary democracy couldn't answer the big question around either Scottish independence or Brexit. So we then threw those questions into referendums and then expected parliamentarians who'd potentially been elected on different priorities to deliver them. I think that's been one of the key factors. And then that whole winner takes all aspect of that our electoral system delivers is definitely part of that. As well. You know, there's lots of talk that 2016 was where people who felt their voices weren't being heard utilise them. And as politicians, whether you two or not, that's something that you've got to be concerned about. One of the encouraging things about this year has been the sort of real increase in community, for community engagement and work that people did to help one another. Certainly in my own constituency, local community sort of COVID-19 support groups were up and running on Facebook and other social media well before the council got itself into action. And so I suppose that's the hope for the future, isn't it? That engagement, that sense of community is still there if we can find a way to fix the system. But certainly, you can say that 43% of the vote for the Conservatives shouldn't deliver an 80-seat majority, but in Scotland, 45% of the vote shouldn't deliver 80% of the seats either. So it's definitely helping parties that are, in a much smaller geographical area to deliver. I suppose it's that whole bit of all votes counting equally, and the current system doesn't allow for that. And as a result, no wonder, therefore, people become disengaged. Joseph, you're on mute. Sorry, hashtag 2020.
So Abhijit from Liverpool got in touch to ask that given that the Labour Party under Keir Starmer is increasingly occupying the centre ground, is there a political place anymore for the Lib Dems?
Well, that's interesting, because if you look at when the Liberal Democrats have done best electorally, it has been when Labour have been doing well. So, in 1997, Tony Blair's government, we know that him and Paddy Ashdown were in conversations. And, we were obviously at our electoral height coming into the 2010 election with the number of seats that we had then. So actually, I would argue, I suppose it goes back to the point I made earlier, that actually we offer, and this is not just about being not Labour. I think we do clearly have a clear and distinct offer, but I think in some respects, some of it is delivered from those people who wouldn't consider Labour, but potentially would consider us as well. Because I mean, for me, the Labour Party is not a particularly liberal party, and that's the thing that I would put at the centre of my values and beliefs. And certainly in terms of the challenges that Labour is facing just now, even with Keir Starmer as leader, is very much testament to that. Oh. Mute again, sorry. And I also must say I've got a 13-year-old now playing Fortnite next door, so hopefully you won't hear him.
We have a question here from Barrera, who asks, how would your approach to the COVID crisis have fundamentally differed from the current government? And what would be your recommendation to the government in tackling the double whammy of Brexit and COVID-19?
So I'll answer the second part first. I think the issue for me is we're talking about the crises we're in. The pandemic is a global pandemic, and governments across the world are dealing with it. But the Brexit crisis is definitely one of the government's own making, and it had opportunities, even while the pandemic was ongoing at early stage, to have asked for an extension or looked for a longer transition period, a number of things that it could have done. So it has taken conscious steps to get us into a position that 6 weeks before the 1st of January, that we don't have clarity about whether we have a deal or not. I've literally sat at this desk all day on meetings. I met with farmers across Fife today, along with other MPs and MSPs from other parties through the National Farmers Union for Scotland, and they've they are hugely concerned about the supply chain that is going to prevent them getting food into supermarkets and other places and onto people's tables. It is a very real and present concern. So I think that would be the first part. In terms of how we respond, I think we've discussed, there are some of the initial steps that were taken that, all governments were in that situation. I do think that we certainly, if you look back, we cancelled our spring conference in the second week of February before the end of January. So I think, that is something that identifies that we saw the size of the challenge that was coming potentially, not very much sooner than others, but that we began to pick up on that. So I think we would have got things in place sooner. I think the key thing for me is the opportunities that have been lost over the course of this year. A good example of this is that every morning, Penny Mordaunt, the Paymaster General, runs a sort of daily morning call for MPs who have any issues that they're having blockages with. And she ran that right at the start of the lockdown as well. And you would have best part of 100 MPs on that call with issues every day. And from a firefighting, triage, crisis management perspective, that was a good resource. If there was something that you were really not getting anywhere with, you could take it up. But those calls are back in place now. I don't think there's the same uptake on them, but that suggests to me that this is a government that hasn't thought about, okay, what's the longer term transitioning here from a crisis management perspective. In terms of intergovernmental relations, the Joint Ministerial Council is supposed to be the main body where the devolved administrations in the UK government meet and discuss. They haven't used the JMC since the start of the pandemic. What they were using was what they call MIGs, which is ministerial implementation groups, again, that are supposed to be used as a sort of triage in initial crisis management. So for me, I think that's been one of the fundamental things. It feels like we have never shifted, and the government has never given that impression of shifting from beyond the firefighting stage. And we really should have moved beyond that by now.
Dan Mikhailov asks, do you think that the government should at any point concede another Scottish referendum?
Well, I think this comes down to the argument around the claim of right that it's the people of Scotland that agree who they are governed by. My position, in terms of my party's position and the position we'll go into to the elections next year, is that we do not believe a second independence referendum at this time is in the best interests of Scotland, and that's what I'll campaign on. Post-May, if the SNP, or indeed the SNP and the Green Party in Scotland, who are quite a different entity from the Green Party in England and Wales, and are pro-independence, win a majority, I think it's a difficult, different question. And I think actually I would encourage you all to have a look at Gordon Brown's New Statesman article, because I think potentially it's not about an independence referendum, it's about agreeing to take a fundamental look at how the United Kingdom operates. I'm pro-UK because I believe that people who have fallen through the welfare gap in Newcastle or in Croydon or in Crewe are just as important as people in Cooper or St Andrews or in the East Newton in my constituency. And so, we need to ensure our democracy is working for everybody. So I think if we can have, and I think, I don't want to use that word opportunity in relation to COVID, but I think the realisation or potentially the shifting in public opinion in other parts of the UK to how they're governed potentially are a way of addressing that, because I think that's quite a difficult thing potentially for a Scottish government, an SNP Scottish government to completely dismiss when there is a real desire to engage in that. Do I think the Conservatives are the party to do that? I'm not convinced, and that obviously concerns me greatly.
On Scottish independence, we have another question here from Grace Chapman. She asks, given that most people in Scotland support independence, how come the Scottish Lib Dems haven't already taken up this position?
Well, I would think my first response to that was a number of opinion polls this year have said that there's now support for Scottish independence. Actually, between 2014 and the start of the pandemic, the opinion polls were pretty static in relation to support for independence. And I suppose this goes back to that whole bit around principles, values, aspects. So for me, I am comfortable that I am pro-UK and pro-EU for the same reasons, in terms of the answers are not about building barriers or walls. It's about how do you build bridges and work together. And because I am not convinced, and nor are my party, that, as I say, we agree with the diagnosis in terms of Westminster not working, but not in terms of what the answer is. And when 60% of Scotland's exports go to the rest of the UK, when we don't have an answer or an idea about what a currency might look like, because it would be a long-term strategy in terms of how we enter into the EU, is that pain? Can I look my children in the eye and say that this decision is worth it because in 25 years' time we might be like Denmark? And actually, because going back to that values bit, I just think we're not that different. Who's watching Strictly at the weekend and The Crown? And culturally, I think, and actually any research or sort of polling that's been done in relation to values show that we're really not that different. And actually, post-Brexit responses to things like immigration, there's been a real softening in the parts of the UK that were very strong on that before and more sympathetic. So, we're all Jock Tamson's bairns. So that's where I stand. But I think, I do recognise, going back to that observation I made around the shift between 2014 and 2019 in terms of how people think about their EU membership in Scotland, that potentially has driven some of it. And I suppose the Brexit vote has made some people question whether those values are the same. But I would also argue that some aspects of this pandemic this year have demonstrated that actually they are.
One idea that's been gaining quite a lot of traction recently with this rise in support for Scottish independence is the idea of a two-stage referendum. So where the first stage is just an initial barometer, yes or no, leave or not, and then a second stage confirmatory vote, similar to the ones that were advocated by your party for Brexit later on, where the terms of the deal have been established. Would you support such a thing if there's a sustained desire in Scotland polling for independence?
I think what I would say is I would always have argued, and obviously I wasn't in politics in 2014, but I would always argue that a two-step approach to such a huge constitutional decision was the right way forward, that there was a need to indicate the direction of travel and then say, okay, well, this is actually what would be delivered. And indeed the Scottish Government have said that they would expect, and this happened prior to 2014 as well, that were there to be a vote for independence, there would be an expectation that there would be a cross-party approach to deliver what had been voted for. And interestingly, post 2014, you did see the Scottish Government or the SNP engage with the changes that were then brought about as a result of the Scotland Act, but on the day that the report was published, to rubbish it. So they didn't work very collegiately. But reality, I think it would be very difficult to deliver something like that in relation to a Scottish independence referendum just now, because I think it would be seen as shifting it would be seen as a unionist attempt to shift the goalposts. And I think that's there is a bit of a concern for me just now, and I appreciate that part of that is potentially for me as a new MP to step up. But I think it's interesting that people saying some of these things are people like John Major and Gordon Brown, and I'm not necessarily sure that they are the best messengers to deliver a future positive vision message in relation to the UK.
Another question here is, Given the rise of right-wing populism in the UK, which countries like New Zealand, which have proportional representation, has not experienced, wouldn't this proportional representation system that you advocate perhaps benefit such groups?
Well, I think that's interesting because, you know, if you look at the data around the election last year, the Brexit Party's biggest impact on the outcome of last year's general election was denying its voters the opportunity to vote for it by withdrawing or not standing in the seats where the Conservatives had held the seat, or in the case of Brecon and Radnorshire, previously held the seat. So I think that in itself is really quite telling. So when I talk about proportional representation or talk about the need for electoral reform, I'm not saying it for the benefit of the progressive or left of centre or left-wing parties. I'm saying it for the benefit of everybody. I would argue that if Nigel Farage had actually had the opportunity to be elected to Parliament, to make his pronouncements on the floor of the House of Commons, would he potentially have ended up in the situation that he is believed to be single-handedly responsible for our departure from the EU? I think what you would see, and incidentally, you've seen it in places like Scotland with proportional systems, where the early parts of the Parliament, you did see some of these fringe parties, some with laudable aims, and like we did have an MSP who was part of a pensioners party, but I do think potentially you see some of those more extreme parties, they have their opportunity to be represented and elected, and people don't like what they hear and then they don't get back in. So I think actually, you know, just because we don't like somebody's party's politics or their views doesn't mean that they shouldn't have a chance to be judged by the electorate in a fair way, to have that voice more widely held, and then, you know, be rejected consequently.
We have a question here from Tahar, who says, why did the Lib Dems distribute leaflets through doorways, putting many households at risk, when the party itself suggests that all party meetings should be held online and people should follow guidelines set by the government? So
in relation to delivery, the Liberal Democrats took guidance from a number of bodies that represent charities in relation to engagement and delivery, and it's been deemed that it is safe to deliver if guidance in relation to delivery is done. Absolutely agree that party meetings, etc., should be done virtually. I'm obviously not running surgeries. I did during when the restrictions were decreased over the summer, and we were to some degree of normality. I did run a couple of outdoor surgeries, you know, at supermarkets, etc. But given the increase in restrictions, I've moved away from doing that, and have always made myself available for online surgeries as a result.
We have another question here, which is that given that last time you had big support among students, you raised their tuition fees, why should students vote for you again?
So, tuition fees. I'm not going to make any excuses or otherwise in relation to that. I think the key message there for any smaller party or for any party is, if you make a commitment, a central platform on which people elect you, and that you then renege on that, you should expect to be treated by the electorate accordingly. And that's clearly what happened in 2015. But what I would say is if you actually look at across our platform and policy base, whether that be in green issues, whether that be in welfare or elsewhere, we do have a very good offer for students. And actually, when you look at our areas of strength, and again, John Curtis said this to me, he said, you know, it's telling that, you know, the MP for the University of St Andrews is a Liberal Democrat, because I think we do have support amongst ABC1 communities, people with degrees, etc., because I think we do have well thought out and evidence-based policy. I think the challenge for us actually is how it is being perceived as that. We have not had a great track record in terms of DE populations, and actually, you know, what are we not doing there? Why are we not seen as a party that cares about those who are potentially much more vulnerable and less well off in our society. Because again, when you actually look at our policy platform, the stuff that is there and would help. And I suppose that comes back to that politics of identity, tribalism, maybe some of the challenge we've seen that, because we've not necessarily got a ground game in some of those areas, we're just a party that's not considered accordingly.
We are running out of time. So as a final question, and apologies if I didn't get to your question, is there any situation where you can foresee the Lib Dems or you yourself working with the Labour Party to attract a wider voter base and remove the Conservatives from power?
Yes, I think there is an opportunity for that, and I'm very conscious that when I think about somewhere like Sheffield Hallam, where we lost very narrowly to Labour in last year, that there's the prospect of working with another party when you've had that local rivalry is very difficult. I would, rather than working directly with Labour, I think I would rather do it in a way. So electoral reform is a really good example. So Make Votes Matter, grassroots campaign, not affiliated to any party. Incidentally, the Brexit Party are signed up to their Fairer Voting Systems pledge because they recognise that they are impacted by our current system. And Make Votes Matter, from that grassroots perspective, are working, so through Labour for Electoral Reform, they work with constituency Labour parties in order to pass motions to make changes, to make a commitment for electoral reform. And that will, from a grassroots perspective, filter up into the upper areas of the party. So I actually think I would rather be in a place, because it comes back to, I suppose, some of the challenges that have been given in the questions that I've had this evening around how do you, what differentiates you from Labour, etc. I think there's a risk if we openly work too closely together that becomes a very pertinent question. So I would rather be in a position where we work on areas of policy where we do align. So, for example, one of the other things that I've done this Parliament is I was the international development spokesperson until the recent reshuffle, and obviously the department went. But I worked closely with Sarah Champion, the Labour Party chair of the International Development Select Committee, because clearly we're aligned, on that issue and the need to ensure that the scrutiny of overseas development assistance spending is maintained. So, I think that's exactly the kind of cross collaboration that potentially maybe we don't do enough of visibly, to show that how parties can work together, and that therefore proportional representation and minority governments isn't something to be scared of.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll hand over now to Barira, the president of the Debate Society, who will just give some closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe, for leading a productive Q&A session. I'd just like to extend our appreciation to Ms. Chamberlain for taking out time to discuss this topic with us so thoroughly, and also to Professor Giovanni for chairing this discussion so effectively as well. We would have certainly loved to host you in person, but we are grateful nonetheless to have hosted you online. We hope to continue platforming discussions on such important topics in the future as well. And so to everyone who is watching or those interested, you can follow our LSE Public Debates page on Facebook to be updated on all our future events. So once again, thank you to everyone who joined, and I hope everyone has a good evening.